San Luis Obispo, we have someone from Department of Mental Health. Los Angeles County, Alameda County, Sonoma County, Marin County, Trinity County, hi Brian, Mono County, Tri-City, Los Angeles, Del Norte. Am I going too fast, Beth? Plumas County, Alpine, San Diego, Kern, Tri-City, LA County, Fresno County, Sierra, Los Angeles again, hello there, another Sandy from LA, San Diego County, San Francisco, Fresno, again, Stanislaus, Marin, Modoc, San Benito, Imperial, Del Norte, Lake, Napa, Merced, Contra Costa, Solano, Placer, Yolo, Santa Cruz, Orange, Sutter Yuba, Mendoland, okay, Mendocino, Santa Barbara, San Bernardino, Lake, hi Jim, whoops, let's see, we just got a bunch, Imperial, Siskiyou, Riverside, Lassen, Tuolumne. So Beth, I'm not seeing your map. Is it up for other people, I hope?
No, we're not seeing it.
There it is. Wow.
There we go.
That's looking very colorful. Okay, now I got to get my chat back.
Wow.
Let's see. We got Inyo. We didn't have that before. Hello, hello, another Inyo. Amador, Butte is here. San Mateo, yay. Santa Clara, another Santa Clara. Shasta, Madera, Mariposa, Calaveras, Nevada's here. Mono, San Joaquin, Alameda. Whoop, some more. Oh, it says looks like only 300 can log on. Okay. Glen, Sierra, Kern. Wow. San Francisco, Humboldt. Wow. That map is looking very impressive. Alameda. Butte County. Some of us are now able to log into the Zoom meeting online. Oh boy. Ventura. We are getting max capacity message. Okay. Tehama. Tehama County. I can't believe this. It means only 2 are left. Tulare. Wow. that Kern that we're missing?
It's Kings that we're missing. So is somebody from Kings here? And
Okay. Well, that is fabulous. We have 300 people. I guess that's the max that can log on. That is really unfortunate. Are they going to be able to participate in some other way? Do we know? Okay, well, I'm sure
We'll
somebody.
try and get them on the phone.
Okay, that sounds good, Shoshana. Okay, well, again, this is incredible. This is, I can say without any hesitation that this has got to be the most saturated participation on behalf of the state of California for this particular event. And I'm really, really pleased to welcome you all. And I hope we can make sure everybody who made the effort to sign up is able to participate somehow. I'm also needing to let you know that I won't be able to introduce Percy Howard, who's the president and CEO of the California Institute for Behavioral Health Solutions. He took ill this morning and he's unable to join us today. He asked that I share the mission and goals of CIBHS, which I'm happy to do. And we have a slide that shows on behalf of CIBHS what we do. The mission of CIBHS is dedicated to improve the lives of people with mental health and substance use disorder challenges through helping health professionals, health organizations, and purchasers of health services. The vision is that CIBHS is the recognized leader in developing world-class behavioral health programs and systems. And the values of CIBHS is customer responsiveness, hope, wellness, resilience, and recovery, empirically informed approaches, cultural and linguistic inclusion, financial sustainability, innovation, and quality workplace. So I, as a behavioral health director, mental health director, always knew CIBHS as the premier educator on behalf of counties and county administrators. And it's a deep pleasure for me to be working with them. Okay, we are going to welcome our two main speakers for the afternoon. Mike Geis and Paula Wilhelm. Mike is the founder of Geis Consulting, a Sacramento-based management consulting firm. He has over 30 years of experience providing services to public sector agencies. He specializes in financial and economic analysis, business processes, improvement, and operations analysis. In my world, Mike is known as the rock star of behavioral health finance. And I can tell you from direct experience, I know he's also very good at playing an air guitar. So as a rock star, his advice and education is sought out and cherished by behavioral health administrators throughout the state. I've always said that as a behavioral health director, I never knew I needed an economist until I met Mike. He not only knows what's what, but he puts it in the context and gives us the big picture. And Paula Wilhelm, we have a picture, I'm sure, a slide of Paula. Paula joined CBHDA as a senior policy analyst in the spring of 2017. She is responsible for SUD-focused legislative and policy projects, as well as housing and workforce issues. Paula has a wonderful way of talking. We were talking a little bit earlier, and I got a quote from her. She was talking about the budget, and the quote, the specificity is in the trailer bill language. And what this tells me, and what I appreciate about Paula, is that kind of language that connotes that she's looking at detail and she's going behind what is generally presented for our information, and really digs to the most basic basic levels. She has, I would say, can pay attention to policy nuances that others don't even know exist. She has a spirited and masterful approach to public policy and manages the complexities with a steady hand. So I would like for us to welcome Mike and Paula for their presentation.
All right. Thank you, Christy. So hopefully you can see there the cover slide for the presentation we're going to go through today. And both
You're not
myself
sharing
and
yet, Mike.
what's that?
Oh, you're not sharing yet.
I always forget that one last button. So there you go. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How's that look? How's that?
Perfect. That looks great.
All right. So our agenda today, we're going to kind of go through, some of the history behind your main funding sources for behavioral health, some of the mandates and the entitlements. So we'll spend a little bit of time with that. Some of you, this is going to be very familiar to. Then we'll get into some of the state budget post COVID-19, both what's going on policy-wise as well as some of the fiscal forecasting are based on the economics of what's going on. Paula's going to talk a little bit about fiscal and budget advocacy that CBHCA has been promoting. And then we'll talk a little bit about local landscape and decision making. And so this is about, I think we've got about an hour and a half to go through this. And then there's a bunch of breakouts and we've got some Q&A, and then Paula's going to cover some hot topics later in the afternoon. So starting off, again, just kind of going through some history. When you look at on the mental health side, we started off in the early 50s or the 50s. Basically, our whole system was run by the state. That happened up until the late 50s, 1957, where the Short-Doyle Act came into play. And so that really took it from kind of the state level and started pushing it out into the communities, and even more so in 1963 with the Community Mental Health Act. Probably a lot of you, or maybe not, have heard of you hear Short-Doyle services. And this is really what it relates to. It goes back to the two legislatures that actually enacted some of the community mental health services through legislation. And then you can see here again, there are various acts throughout over time that changed the service delivery system. Really what more recently, meaning like 1991, is where we started having the 91 realignment, or the Bronson-McCorkindale Act. Then we changed our service delivery system from a clinic option to a rehab option under the Medi-Cal program. Then we went into Medi-Cal, especially mental health, managed care, which was implemented over a several year period, 95 through 97. And then we had the enactment or passage of Prop 63, or the Mental Health Services Act, in 2004. And then more recently, we had public safety realignment in 2011. As well as we had a bunch of changes to MHSA brought about by AB 100 in 2011, which again really changed our funding and our service delivery. And meanwhile, at the same time, there were other things going on in terms of our partnerships with, broader healthcare system integration, the whole, Affordable Care Act and the Bridge to Reform under the 1115 waiver, which began in 2010. We had the expanded outpatient mental health benefits in 2014. And then really, finally, something significantly happened on the drug Medi-Cal side in 2015 with the expansion through the pilots of the drug Medi-Cal ODS. And then in 2016, the Medicaid managed care final rule. So we had a lot going on, just kind of give you a little history there. But really, when you go back to 1957, and fortunately, I wasn't involved with mental health funding at that point. The real thing was, it kind of came back to, it was set up, that through statutes to have this mental health service delivery system, and it was funded with state general monies. But it always had this caveat that mental health services were provided to the extent resources are available. And so you kind of had this illusion of a broad-based system, but it was really, by saying to the extent resources are available, it really created a rationing of resources. And then on the drug Medi-Cal side, SUD side, we really had a pretty limited benefit here in California in the drug Medi-Cal system up until about 2010. We then, and so that was really kind of a weak, so it wasn't a very robust system. We also had the SAPG grant that began in 1993. That is what a lot of counties were relying on for providing SUD services throughout California. And then we had the expansion of the NTP services, narcotic services, in 1994 with the lawsuit Sopke versus Smoley. And then we had, again, a much more robust expansion with the 2011 realignment. And that really, again, codified the role of counties in terms of their responsibilities for the delivery of substance use disorder services. So that's just, real brief history. And so then the different funding streams that we have available to really fund those services are our 1991 realignment, our 2011 realignment, the Mental Health Services Act, the FFP through the Medi-Cal program, which is a reimbursement. And then we have other funds, both state general funds, some local funds, and various grants that are used to fund behavioral health services. So we'll go through each one of these pretty quick here. Starting off with 91 realignment. Again, back in 1990, 1991, we had the passage of the Bronson-McCorkindale Act. What really brought about this whole shift or realignment of services that were previously state general fund services shifted down to the counties, again, was a budget crisis. That was really the push for it. The thought was from a mental health director's perspective that by tying our funding to what was hopefully an increasing revenue stream, we would receive additional dollars rather than constantly having to negotiate with the legislature every year in order to get funding. So in terms of the responsibilities, again, it pushed what was previously state general fund services through a county performance contract down to the counties. It required counties, it further defined the population, children with serious emotional disturbance and adults that are SMI or serious mental illness. But again, it kept the clause in there that you're responsible for these services to the extent resources are available. And the programs themselves that were realigned, we had all community-based mental health services. It has the services provided through the state hospital for the civil commitment. And then it also realigned the services provided in IMDs which were more the long-term nursing facility care. And then the legislation specified that you could use these funds to match federal Medi-Cal where appropriate. So how is realignment funded? It has three sources of revenue. It has a 1/2 cent of the state sales tax. So sales tax were increased by 0.5%. There's also some state vehicle license fees, which are the registration fees that folks pay for their vehicles. It's not 100% of those fees, but it's a portion of those. And then for mental health, we get 14 million of state vehicle license fee collections, which are fines and penalties paid by people who don't pay their registration on time. There also is a county maintenance of effort required. For some of the super small counties, that number is 0. And that was adjusted. So we went into realignment 91, everybody had a county maintenance of effort, and revenues went down out of the gate. And so they lowered the MOE within the first several years. And that amount that it was lowered to is what is still the required maintenance of effort today. I want to say it's 48 million statewide, so it's not a lot of money. So how realignment funds are distributed. So as revenues come into the state, they're distributed to counties based upon, well, initially back in 91, based on the prior state general fund county allocations. And so that's what kind of drove the initial allocations of the sales tax and vehicle license fee. Growth, when we've actually had growth, it's a little bit more complex, and it's different for sales tax versus vehicle license fees. So the first claim or priority for sales tax growth is to fund any increase in caseload-driven social services costs, which really took off with the IHSS program and the expansion of the IHSS program. So to the extent there is growth in sales tax, social service gets priority first. After that, the caseload costs are funded. Any remaining growth in the sales tax goes into a general growth account for sales tax, and then there's a VLF growth that's distributed to the different programs. The other part of this is that you'll often see growth attributed to a fiscal year. Well, in fact, that growth isn't distributed. It's not known and distributed till we're into the next fiscal year, generally around October or November. And then with 91, whatever you received in total in the prior year becomes your base for the next year. And so when things are going up, your base is equal to what the prior year base plus the prior year growth becomes your next year base. The downside is that when we don't meet base, all the programs are reduced proportionally, basically because as funds are coming in, they're getting distributed out. And so if it doesn't hit that base number, then everybody's reduced proportionally. And then that becomes the base for the next year. So we kind of had this structure in place for roughly 20 years. And then again, we get into 2011, states facing some fiscal issues, and they swap it up again. And what they did was they took what mental health was earning in 1991 realignment and used it to pay part of the state's maintenance of effort on the CalWORKS program. And that began in 11-12. So basically this CalWORKS MOE is now funded with the sales tax and vehicle license fees that would have gone to mental health. In order to do that, they had to guarantee that mental health would receive a certain amount of funding. And so that is what we have. We have this guaranteed minimum amount of funding of $1.12 billion that that goes to mental health as part of this CalWORKS MOE swap. And then once the revenues going into sales tax and VLF meet that CalWORKS MOE swap amount, that the guaranteed minimum amount for mental health, anything over and above that then became additional growth and then subsequently base for mental health services. And so that happened in 13-14. We received some growth. And so coming into this year, mental health had a base for both sales tax and VLF due to growth beginning in 13-14. And then as a reward for letting this happen to mental health, we also get this kind of one-off of 5% of the growth in the 2011 realignment support services account. So when there's growth, we just get a check. And again, that has no impact on your base. It's just a funding that you receive. So that then kind of, again, feeds into, you've got 4 different allocations, or you had 4 different allocations, which we'll talk about later. For 1991 realignment, you've got this fixed guaranteed amount of the 1.12 billion. The other thing to point out off that's the gross amount. The state also offsets any state hospital payments and managed care payments against that. So you have a gross amount that's fixed, but your net amount's going to vary depending on state hospitals and your managed care usage in the fee-for-service Medi-Cal hospitals. But then, like I said, we also now have a mental health sales tax base and a mental health VLF base, which are revenues that were in excess of the 1.12 billion that was guaranteed. And then the 14 million that we receive in VLF collections is guaranteed as well. So those are the 4 different checks that you would receive, or warrants that you would receive, and that you track. So one thing, and this will come into play this year, and it actually comes into play every year, but CalWORKS MOE is funded before the state funds the mental health sales tax base and the mental health VLF base, because they want to make sure that sufficient revenues have come in to fact meet the $1.12 billion. And so in general, what that's meant is that we don't receive a check for these two, for VLF or sales tax base, until we're into August. So it's revenues that were earned in the prior year, but we don't actually see it until we're into the next fiscal year. And again, to the extent that there is growth, those amounts are placed into separate growth accounts. So a couple of things, some key points, and this has been talked about for years. None of the funding is really tied to the demand for services. It's driven by what's going on in the economy with sales tax. We are guaranteed that minimum level of funding, which is nice, the 1.12 billion. And although I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the actual numbers. So that part is nice. The other nice thing about this is that the individual county allocations have not changed. So you can look at what % you're receiving of the funding, and you're going to pretty much continue to get that same percentage. And then a nice thing about this funding is that you don't have to spend it within a certain period of time. So you can roll over funds basically indefinitely. And so really this is, from a flexibility standpoint, 1991 realignment is your most flexible funding stream of the 3 major funding streams. And so, kind of looking forward a little bit, and we'll talk about the specific numbers in a little bit. But, we're seeing a decrease in 1920 revenues due to the COVID-19, and it's really 2 different things. there's the actual economic implications of shutting down the economy, and then there's also some policy implications that's pushing revenue into the next year. So as a result of that, we do anticipate that there will be growth in revenue as the economy recovers, but it's highly unlikely we're going to see much in the way of growth, because the sales tax growth is going to be used to fund IHSS caseload cost increases, while on the VLF side, any growth is going to have to be used to get that CalWORKS MOE back up to the $1.12 billion level. So that's 1991 realignment. So talking a little bit about 2011 realignment. Again, same sort of deal, economy's in bad shape. So the state decides to shift various responsibilities to the counties from the state, things that were previously state general funds, and it was law enforcement, social services, and behavioral health. Again, this was largely driven by the state budget crisis, not counties requesting to take on these additional realigned responsibilities. And really kind of, again, the bottom line, and you can see some of the goals there, but really the bottom line was to take revenues that were going into the state general fund that then were required to be split with education based on the Prop 98 requirements, where a large portion of any state general fund revenue needs to go towards education. So you pull it out and dedicate it specifically for these services. And so it basically reduced the amount of funding for education while dedicating a specific revenue source for these services. And so here you can kind of see a little graphic on what happened. The specific revenue it's a little bit over 1% of the sales tax that is predominantly what funds 2011 realignment. There's a little bit of VLF that's a specific amount for a law enforcement program. So our programs are not impacted by the VLF that comes in. So ours is really just the sales tax. And again, these are programs that were previously funded, state general fund monies that were realigned. And then don't forget that we had the roughly 860 million of MHSA funds that were used in 11-12 to fund these services, because the state could not, there wasn't enough revenue to basically do the entire realignment that they needed to do. So they took some of the MHSA in 11-12 and used it to fund some of the mental health programs that were being realigned. So in terms of, from a behavioral health, so we have this behavioral health sub-account, and what was really transferred to the counties, it's the Medi-Cal mental health managed care. So when we went to managed care beginning in 95, there was a state general fund share of, that was basically an allocation that was transferred to the Medi-Cal specialty mental health plans, which are U counties. And that was for taking on the responsibility of being the sole provider of Medi-Cal specialty mental health services. So that was realigned, that allocation was realigned. There also was some state funding, and this was the largest chunk that was realigned for behavioral health. The state was sued in the mid-90s for not providing a sufficient benefit for early and periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment for full scope 21 and under Medi-Cal beneficiaries. And so that program, which started off, I want to say it was roughly a $30 or $40 million program, it's now over $1 billion. So that the funding for that was a combination of Medi-Cal federal dollars, state general fund dollars, and county funding. So the state general fund was included in this realignment and behavioral health sub-account. All SUD services that were funded with state general fund monies were realigned, which had all the drug Medi-Cal benefits, drug courts, perinatal drug services, and then the non-drug Medi-Cal substance use services. And there were provisions placed into the 2011 realignment language that basically says DHCS can take money from your behavioral health sub-account if a county's not meeting the obligations of basically the entitlement programs, which is Medi-Cal, especially mental health, and drug Medi-Cal. So we had the realignment part go into place 2011. There was subsequently Proposition 30 that was placed on the ballot and passed by the voters that added some elements that provided some protections to the counties that really says that if the state increases any sort of obligations or costs to the counties, the state has to share in those costs. They can't just increase requirements on the counties and expect the counties to fully fund that. And so that's why you see various state general fund allocations for different pots of money. The two main ones that we see are for the state match on the Affordable Care Act, Medi-Cal beneficiaries that's funded with state general fund monies as a result of Prop 30, and then also on the ODS waiver, which are some new responsibilities. And again, you see a little bit of funding for state general fund monies there. In terms of how the actual money's distributed to counties, we're finally now, we went years with kind of this mishmash of not really even knowing what it's going to look like, but now we're to the point where it is a kind of rolling base sort of concept. In fiscal year 16-17, set your individual base allocation and take a look at that. But basically, it was driven by historical EPSDT claims on the mental health side, drug Medi-Cal claims, and then the allocations for the other SUD services and the allocations for Medi-Cal managed care. And so we do have now where the subsequent fiscal year allocations are based on the rolling base concept, where your current year base is equal to the prior year base plus the prior year growth. It lags a little bit, so it's not 100% true, but it's pretty close. And really, the growth, when we've had growth, which we've always had growth up until this year, it's distributed based on a formula now, or the last couple of years, where what you actually do through your claims, and it derives about half of it, and then the other half is driven by basically your risk, which is based on the percent of Medi-Cal beneficiaries that are in your county, and those are weighted based on different 8 code groupings. And so foster care and disabled, where you have the highest risk, if you have a higher percentage of those, then you get a little bit more weighting towards those beneficiaries. So again, some key points. Funding is not tied to the enrollment or demand for services. Again, it's driven by economic conditions. Some of the growth is distributed based on the Medi-Cal entitlements, but to the extent there isn't growth and you grow an EPSDT program, you're not going to get any more money. You've got flexibility to use these funds between any of the behavioral health programs. So it isn't specific. You've got to put a certain amount into SUD and a certain amount into mental health. The state has monitored. They're not doing it as much anymore as if it was categorical. So I think maybe that we're getting away from that, which is great, because you should have flexibility at the local level to do what you want to do on that. And just like 91 realignment, there is no limit in terms of how long you can roll these funds over. However, to the extent that you are building up 2011 balances, you know, especially the EPSDT providers will take a look at that and say, are you doing what you're required to be doing under the EPSDT benefit? In terms of some of the impacts of the COVID-19 on 2011, again, you know, we just like 91, we're going to have this decrease in current year due to both economic implications of closing the economy as well as some policy implications. We do anticipate revenue to grow as the economy recovers. The nice thing about this is that rather than having there be a variant each year in your actual county allocation, it should be fairly fixed going forward until we get back up to our base level. And our base level really is what your 18-19 base plus your 18-19 growth. So that percentage should be pretty predictable over the next couple of years until we get back to having funds restored at that base funding level. So now going into MHSA, you know, again, this is the millionaire tax. Very few folks pay it. You know, probably one of the key things you need to know is that 1.76% of all monthly personal income tax payments go into the state mental health services fund. And then there's a true up with the actual tax returns, and an annual adjustment based on those tax returns is deposited into the account. So what's important here about the monthly personal income tax payments is as those decline due to unemployment with COVID-19, then those amounts are going to go down. So historically, cash transfers are larger in months that there are estimated tax payments and year-end tax payments. And you can see those are the months in which generally those payments are made. This year is a little different, of course. And then the annual adjustments, as you'll see, are incredibly volatile. That they do lag by 2 years. They're generally known by March 15th prior to the start of a fiscal year, which is nice, but they're just volatile, and they often dictate whether we end up positive, whether we go up or down in a given fiscal year in terms of our revenue. In terms of the county funding, you get funds distributed to you on a monthly basis. This is one of the AB 100 provisions that was put into place. And it's based on the unexpended and unreserved funds that are in the fund at the end of the month. And many of you have seen the Department of Finance calculation of that. CBHDA publishes that when they receive it, showing you what's being reserved. And the state can reserve up to 5% for state administration. You then get one check or warrant from the state, and you're required as a county to ensure compliance that the appropriate amount goes into the different components, 5% into innovative programs, and then 19% for PEI and 76% for community services and supports. You're required at the local level to have a local mental health services fund. And then how your individual county allocation percentages are I mean, and we've got a couple of things here: estimated need, self-sufficiency, and resources has a little adjustment. There's a bunch of small county minimum allocations. And if you want, you can look at Info Notice 19043 to look at the methodology, but really it's driven by population. So, you know, with some minor tweaks, it's predominantly driven by population. And then in terms of your expenditures, you're required to have a 3-year program and expenditure plan. You go through the stakeholder process to get approval of that plan. And all your expenditures need to be consistent with that plan. So it's really good to be able to tie back your expenditures that you're reporting on the annual revenue and expenditure report, how that directly ties back to your approved plan. You can't supplant existing resources, that's in the statute, but then there's subsequent regulations that basically say you can't supplant what was spent in 04, 05. So it's not an annual sort of basis. It's looking back at what you were doing prior to passage of the MHSA. It generally cannot be used for involuntary services, so everything needs to be voluntary in nature. The one exception is there are some regulations that allow for short-term acute care to be paid for with MHSA for your full service partners who are either uninsured or there's no additional resources available. And then in general, you can't use MHSA for services to individuals who are incarcerated in state or federal prisons. So again, some key points here. You know, you got these volatile resources or revenues driven by, basically based on people making decisions with their finances. We're going to see a large decrease in the current year and subsequent increase next year due to, again, some of these policy implications around COVID-19 and delay of tax filing. Then we're going to see probably a large decrease in 22-23 due to the settling up of the annual adjustment for the current tax year. And again, you know, the amount of funding is not guaranteed to you folks, so there is definitely more risk to the counties. Some other key points: your cash flow varies significantly, you know, throughout the fiscal year. It's not like you can straight line this from month to month. I'm not going to go into detail on any of these different tools, but you've got a local prudent reserve that you can use. You do have a 3-year reversion period, or 5 years for some of the small counties. So you can use those as tools to manage the funding, especially given like what you're going to see. Expenditures must be consistent with approved plan. Unlike 91 realignment and 2011 realignment, these funds do have a certain amount of time that must be considered, and you must spend those within a specified time frame, or with innovations, at least get those committed to a specific Oversight and Accountability Commission approved project. And then the state has recalculated the allocation percentages, which makes it a little bit more difficult to predict your individual county allocations on a year-to-year basis. And then so real quickly, some other funding, you know, Medi-Cal behavioral health so the Medi-Cal side of this is a reimbursement based on your certified public expenditures. So obviously you've got to have sufficient revenue in order to incur certified public expenditures. The amount that you get depends on generally based on the Medi-Cal beneficiaries aid code. Really, you don't know the final entitlement amount until really you go all the way through audit. And I think Paul is going to talk about some of that stuff in Hot Topics. And the other thing, because really in this program, at least right now, the incentive is to maximize volume of services, and there's no anything along those lines. So it's really driven by the amount of services you provide and you know, how well you're able to document, basically. There's also some state general funds. Again, I talked about the Prop 30 earlier, and there's a little bit of state general fund. Most of it, so the last three there are allocations, while the ACA expansion population, that's where the majority of state general fund money for Medi-Cal, especially mental health, is. There also are some various grant programs that were enacted 2 years ago, funded last year. So you've got some grants for the incompetent to stand trial that are funded through the Department of State Hospitals. The homeless outreach that was $50 million, and then $10 million to the homeless youth and exploration program. And then again, there's additional funding. Some of you folks contribute additional county funds called overmatch, you know, based on the amount of your local resources that you have available. I think in general, you know, most counties don't get additional county general fund. The one exception to that is maybe counties that operate Hospitals may get some county general fund. There's the mental health block grant funded through SAMHSA. And then there's other third-party revenues, insurance and Medicare. So kind of bottom line, as we go through this, majority of your funding is driven by economic conditions and not demand for services. And in fact, the need for services is often counter-cyclical to when you're getting the revenue. As I kind of brought up throughout this discussion, 91 is the most flexible, followed then by 2011 behavioral health sub-account. And that one can only be used on SUD and Medi-Cal, especially mental health. And then MHSA, which again needs to be tied to a specific plan for voluntary services, et cetera. What's interesting is that each funding source historically has kind of been used for different sets of services and unique populations. And so when these funding sources ebb and flow at different rates, it kind of creates this disparity among the different services and populations. So it's kind of an interesting caveat on how this all works. And then obviously, going forward as revenues are declining, you want to maximize Medi-Cal. It's the only thing that really you have control over. So make sure you're getting your treatment services approved through the Medi-Cal program. Also, don't treat MHSA as if it's a silo and that you can't do Medi-Cal in it, when in fact you can. And so now we're going to jump into, so again, that was kind of the history, and I probably took way too long doing that. But we're going to go through some of the fiscal forecast, and I think Paul is going to start with some high-level budget, some budget stuff. So Paula, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, so I know one of the main topics that you all were interested in exploring today is looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on our core behavioral health funding sources. And so I think that refresher on how each funding source works that Mike just provided is great context for that. And before we get into the projections about what's going to happen in the coming budget cycles, we thought it would also be helpful to share a little bit of information about the budget process and where we are right now as a state. So typically, if you'll recall, the governor comes out with a budget proposal in January, and then the legislature spends 5 to 6 months haggling over their version of the budget. And they have until June 15th to pass a budget. Meanwhile, the governor comes out with a May revised proposal, which is often based on updated revenue forecasts, so can be a little bit different from January in some areas. And then again, the legislature passes their version by June 15th. Typically, that version is largely a version that the administration is prepared to agree to, and they have 2 weeks to, the governor then has 2 weeks to sign or veto the legislature's budget. This year, we have a couple things that are going to be different about that process. Due to COVID-19, we have a very, very different fiscal picture coming into May and June than we did when the governor put out his initial proposal in January. And we'll talk a little bit more about those differences as we go through the presentation. But what that means is, well, in part that we're going to have kind of a two-phase budget process potentially, because the tax filing deadline has been deferred until July. Even the May revise, we don't have a super accurate projection of what the state tax revenues are going to be. So we will proceed on the usual timeline and pass a budget this week that the governor has until July 1 to sign. But there may also be a second budget cycle in August where we'll get the actual tax revenues from the July filing, and then the legislature and the governor will come back, compare the actual revenues to the projections, and adjust the budget if further cuts need to be made or if some things can be restored. The other part that we wanted to highlight that is a little different in this case due to COVID is that both the governor's proposed budget and the version that will be passed by the legislature will include trigger mechanisms based on the availability of federal funding. So we may get additional relief, COVID-19 relief dollars passed at the federal level. And if that happens, we would be able to forestall or compensate for cuts that are planned in the current budget. Notably, the administration and the legislature are looking at this a little bit differently. So both the governor's May proposal and then the package that was just passed by the legislature on Monday does include these trigger mechanisms. But the administration took a little more conservative approach where they are looking at making cuts effective July 1 as we go into the new fiscal year. And then they would restore certain programs if federal funding becomes available. On the legislature's side, they are taking a slightly more optimistic approach and resisting some of the cuts that were proposed by the governor in anticipation of receiving federal dollars. So their version actually includes funding for some programs that were cut by the governor. And then if we don't get the federal funds by September, cuts would start to take effect. And so where we are right now this week, again, is the legislature did pass a budget bill on Monday per their June 15th deadline. Now the governor has 2 weeks to sign that or veto. Other fun facts, he could theoretically veto the whole thing if there's enough daylight between what the administration wants to see and what the legislature has included. That does not happen often. I believe it happened in 2010-11 with Governor Brown. And then prior to that, I've been told it was something like 1901, the last time that a governor vetoed an entire budget. What he more typically does is use the blue pencil authority to veto line items that were included by the legislature. So those are all possibilities as we go through the next weeks. And so a lot of the discussion we're having today and the information you'll see on the slides is based on what we know about the legislature's proposal, but we just have to keep emphasizing that it's not final yet. We can go to the next slide. And there's a few slides here where we just wanted to speak to the bigger budget picture and what looks different now than it looked in January, again, due to COVID-19. So in January, we had a very rosy budget outlook. We had a $220 billion state general fund budget proposed. We had historically low unemployment at 3.9%. Following COVID-19, that picture completely changed. We needed to shrink the size of the state general fund contribution to the budget, and instead of projecting a $5.6 billion surplus, the governor in the May revise projected a $54.3 billion deficit, and that was $13.4 billion occurring in 2019-20 and $40.9 billion in the coming budget year for 2020-21, and again due to lost revenues from COVID-19. We're also cruising, unfortunately, towards much, much higher unemployment as a state. That's one of the driving causes of that lack of revenue. And so in the May revise, the governor really had to look at what's essential in the budget and where sort of discretionary cuts could be made. So with Medi-Cal specifically, there are some optional benefits that the state typically funds that don't have to be funded in all states. There will be some cuts to those. Some of these are compensatory because Medi-Cal caseloads are also projected to grow as personal incomes are impacted and more people become eligible for Medi-Cal. I think we can go to the next slide. Yes, and we wanted to highlight the status on CalAIM. This would have been, as you all know, DHCS's proposal for delivery system transformation in Medi-Cal, and specifically parts of CalAIM were to be enacted through the renewals of our 1915B managed care waiver for specialty mental health and the 1115 demonstration waiver, which includes the drug Medi-Cal ODS demonstration, as well as other whole person care pilots and other managed care programs. Thanks to COVID-19, the renewal and negotiation timelines for both waivers have been delayed. And so right now, DHCS is proposing basically a 1.5-year renewal on the 1915B so that it would be renewed in essentially its current form through the end of 2021, and also a year-long renewal of the 1115 running through that same period. And on the 1915B, we've been granted so far a 6-month renewal, but I think DHCS anticipates CMS is open to the additional renewal through year 2021. So all of the good things that we had talked about in CalAIM are being pushed down the road. That included significant behavioral health program proposals like payment reform, changes to medical necessity. Some of those had been accounted for in the budget in January, and they are no longer included in the May revise in the legislature's proposal because there's agreement that CalAIM will be delayed. So there's some savings there, and notably, there were supposed to be implementation funds that would have gone directly to counties to implement things like payment reform and the coding transition that needed to precede payment reform. That was the $87 million that would have been the Behavioral Health Quality Improvement Program. That has been eliminated, again, due to the delay in CalAIM. So, next slide. This is another slide that covers some of the adjustments the governor proposed in Medi-Cal to account for lower revenues, higher caseloads. So there is the FMAP increase that was passed at the federal level. I think we'll talk about that in a couple of other slides. It has not been implemented yet. It's a 6.2% across the board increase for Medicaid, and then a 4-point-something% for CHIP programs. So that will create some general fund savings. There's Proposition 56 tobacco tax funds that had been used to fund provider rate increases. The governor is proposing to stop those rate increases and just shift those funds to support Medi-Cal programs. And then we have some Medi-Cal managed care items. We recently passed an MCO tax on the plans that helped to augment the general fund budget. Nonetheless, there are going to be some rate cuts for the managed care plans to account for the fact that they're delivering fewer services following COVID-19. So right now the proposal is to cut rates by 1.5% on the managed care side. Okay, next slide, please. And then I think maybe one of the last things we were going to call out here before Mike gets into the projections, the budget does include some additional CARES Act funding. So the CARES Act was the $2 trillion relief package passed by Congress at the federal level in March. California received $15.3 billion based on its population. $9.5 billion of that was paid directly to the state, 5.8 distributed to cities and counties with large populations. And so the state is taking some of that funding that went directly to the state and passing it on to counties through the budget in another allocation. So specifically, there will be $1.3 billion allocated to counties for public health, behavioral health, and other health and human services. Next slide. And so those funds at the county level, this is a slide that sort of illustrates how they can and cannot be used based on federal law. I think an important thing to mention about this as you're thinking about it locally is, you know, the county is going to get kind of a lump sum, and to my knowledge, there's not any language that then tells the county what they have to do with that amount. So there will be local decision-making happening about what portion of each county's lump sum might go to behavioral health. So those are conversations that have been, I think, already happening locally. To the extent that that funding does come to your department in the counties, it must be used for actions taken to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it can't supplant. That's a typical provision with federal funding. Obviously, also, since it's federal funding, it cannot be used as a non-federal share of a Medicaid payment. You can't match a federal dollar with a federal dollar. And then we have some examples of the COVID-19 related expenses where that CARES Act funding might come in handy, things like purchasing PPE and hazard pay. Next slide.
All
This
right.
is you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. So this just kind of gives you, you know, a graphic representation of what the projections look like for next year, you know, based on what we know today. Again, you know, you can see that, you know, more than half of your funding is driven by the economic conditions. A good chunk, which is, you know, the two realignments in Mental Health Services Act. You got a good chunk that's you do have a little bit of control over on the FFP, on the Medi-Cal reimbursements, and then there's a little bit of funding left over. And so looking at that on a year-over-year basis, just kind of summarized, and I'm going to go through again the three major revenue sources that are tied more to allocations and economic conditions. But you can see, you know, overall, we're taking a pretty big hit this fiscal year, again, due to both economic conditions and some of the policy implications of COVID-19. Comes back a little bit next year, but part of that is because we're moving money from this year to next year, and then it goes down again. And so we'll kind of go through each one of these. So in terms of the actual impact of COVID-19 on our 91 realignment, so again, two different, I like to call it the economic conditions and then the policy implications. So the economic implications are, you know, basically the business was shut down, right? You know, the economy really took a hit. Stay at home, don't go to restaurants, can't go buy clothes, can't go buy cars, or you could, but it was a little more difficult. And based on that, the estimate was that the current year revenue, 1920 revenue, would have probably been down about 5 to 10%, purely based on the economic contraction of the economy due to shutting down the economy, basically. So that was one part of it. So prior to, I mean, it might have even been through March, I want to say we were up, you know, a good 4 or 5%. But with this, we're looking at, you know, pretty significant hits. Although, to be honest with you, I don't know if we've even seen the full impact of the hits, because the federal government, through the stimulus payments, through the enhanced unemployment benefits, has kind of been propping up the economy. A lot of that's going to go away next month, or at least the unemployment benefits will. So then we'll start to see, I think, more of this start to happen. And then we have the policy implications where the administration within California, Governor Newsom, is allowing small businesses to defer sales and use tax by up to 12 months. So again, what that did was sales and use tax that was earned in the current fiscal year in 1920 really won't get paid until we're into 2021. And so that overall impact is anticipated to be about 300 million on 1991 realignment in total, not specifically mental health, but in total, about 300 million of revenues that would have gone to realignment, 91 realignment this year will end up getting paid next year. And that will trickle in throughout the year because the small businesses have 12 months to pay those deferred sales tax revenues. So as a result, we're for sure not going to hit our base for 1920, but the distributions will then become the new base because, like I said, for 1920, it's whatever you receive in the prior year plus growth then becomes your base for the next year. In this particular case, it's just whatever comes in, irrespective of when it was earned, is going to be the base. At least at this point, that's what the state has put out. Then, as we start to see growth in revenues, and we do anticipate to see a little bit of 2021 revenues increase, and more so 22, 23, 23, 24. You're going to have these caseload costs for social services that have built up, and those will get funded first before there's additional sales tax growth money available to restore our base. So we don't really anticipate at this point, looking at the revenue projections put out by the administration, that we will fully get back to our base until we're into 24, 25. So in other words, we're going to, well, you'll see in a second. Now, the nice thing is that there is a budget proposal that would backfill overall $1 billion between 91 realignment and 2011 realignment. And I think the way it was initially drafted, or the most recent version I saw, was it was going to be split equally. So 500 million to 91 realignment, 500 million to 2011 realignment. And this is part of the legislature's budget, right, Paula, that went forward, the $1 billion backfill.
Yes, that's included.
Yeah, and so not necessarily, we don't know whether the governor is warm to this idea or not. What's important also to know about this is that 200 million of it is state general funds that would get deposited next month, but then 300 million is dependent on receiving federal funds. And so that is obviously very questionable at this point in terms of the federal funds. So it's nice, it's some hope. It would definitely help. Definitely CBHDA has earned their money lobbying for this. So, thank the association for that. But we still have to wait and see if it happens. So based on all that, this is kind of what we're looking at in terms of revenues over the next couple of years. So again, last year, 18-19, we had a sales tax base and we had a mental health vehicle license fee base. Because of both the economic implications of COVID-19, actually solely due to that, I don't think we would have hit the base for this year. Because remember, CalWORKs MOE gets funded before our sales tax and VLF base get funded. So it was highly likely, even just with the economic implications of the shutdown of the economy, that we would have received any money for our sales tax or VLF base. But then because the sales tax is being shifted to next year, the delay for the small businesses, that guaranteed we're not going to hit our base this year. And in fact, we don't anticipate hitting or receiving any sort of growth and to start to build back up our base during the course of the chart here. But the one thing you'll notice is that this 1.12 billion is guaranteed. And so there's no reason we shouldn't anticipate receiving that. The the one caveat to that is if somehow sales tax revenues, they'd have to fall, I want to say it's by about 70% in a given month for us not to meet the monthly amount that is the first dibs for getting this funded. So I think I would feel pretty sure that we're going to continue to receive that CalWORKS MOE swap money at that amount. And like I said, I don't anticipate seeing either of our bases into the near future, and probably not until 24, 25. And you know, just to refresh your memory, we've been, our base amount for both sales tax and VLF has been flat for 3 years, 4 years now. And so now we're actually going to decline. And again, it's going to be fairly flat for the next 4 or 5 years. The one-time funds here, so this is mental health's share of the 200 million in state funds and 300 million in federal funds. That would be a nice little bump for the current year. You know, again, at this point, if it was me budgeting, I definitely would not budget for the federal funds. I might consider budgeting for the state funds, or at least have a placeholder, because I think we'll know sooner on the state funds whether that's going to happen. But I think the federal funds are you know, at best a 50-50 shot at this point. And then the last thing you see on here is the 5% of support services growth account. Again, 18-19, we received that. That generally, you know, like the growth, you don't actually get it till you're into the next fiscal year. So we received that in October of 2019. So some of you might have budgeted that. And likewise, even with the sales tax base and VLF base, you might have budgeted it in current year. But the anticipation is there's not going to be any growth in that 2011 account. It's all going to be base restoration, you know, into the foreseeable future. So maybe, you know, so it probably, and this is the one thing that scared me, is you had very little time to react to both the economic implications and the policy implications of COVID-19 in the current year. So a lot of you are going to have to pull on to the extent you had it, you know, fund reserves to close the books, hopefully balanced in the current fiscal year. Maybe you'll get a little relief next year, but then we're going to be back at this same level. I would have bet at least through 23, 24 and into 24, 25. So then talking about 2011, and again, remember, this is driven primarily by the same revenue source, sales tax, as we have for 91. So same sort of impact, where you had the economic impact of, you know, just the shutdown of the economy, estimated to be about 5 to 10% on current year revenues. And then the deferral by the small business sales tax payments will also push in actually quite a bit of the 2011 money, estimated to be about 628 million from current year into budget year. And so that's pushing money. The thing with 2011 that's different than 91 is that really this is more of a base restoration when there's a decline. This will be the first year that we have a decline. And rather than like 91, where growth first goes to sales tax, or first goes to caseload costs, and then the rest goes to general growth, here we actually have a restoration of the base funding level. So if you look at your 1890 base plus your 1819 growth, that really is your true base for 2011. And as sales tax increases, funds will be used to restore your allocations back up to that base level. And again, just like 91, don't anticipate that occurring until 24, 25. And similar here, where we've got, you know, the state budget proposal to backfill 2011 realignment, same sort of thing. And so if it happens, it'd be great. And it'll really just buy you, from my perspective, buys you a little bit of time to plan your systems a little bit for the next couple of years without having to have such a huge hit. But we still need to wait and see if it happens. And so what are we looking at? So, again, your 18-19 base plus your 18-19 growth, that becomes the new base. That $1.483 billion is really the base. And so we're going to go down, and then we're going to try to restore back up to that amount. The anticipation is for current year, that's going to be about 1.2 billion, a little bit more. And again, part of that's due to the economic conditions. Part of it's due to the delay in sales tax. You can see here the distribution or potential distribution of the backfill. Again, I don't know if I would count on that 74 million in federal funds. Maybe a placeholder for the state funds at this point. But you'll also notice, so again, unlike 91, which is treated as true growth, here we start to see that, yeah, we do start to build up as additional sales tax revenue comes in. But until we get to almost 1.5 billion, we're just going to be kind of keeping, trying to restore our base. And so that is what 2011 realignment looks like. Now, MHSA. So same sort of thing. We've got the economic conditions because of a lower amount of personal income taxes being earned in the fiscal year. We anticipate, that to be about a 5 to 10% economic decrease. However, we also anticipate a huge decrease, about a 300 million decrease due to the deferred revenue that we would have received in the current year that we're not going to get until next fiscal year. And that's due to the deadline for the 2019 tax filing being moved to July 15th, as well as the first and second quarter estimated tax payments are also moved to July 15th. The nice thing about this, though, is, yeah, it's deferred from this year to next year, but you're going to get a huge chunk of money in August because all this money should come into the state in July. And in addition, we have the annual adjustment that's going to post in July. So the amount that you receive in mid-August should be huge. So it's not like you're waiting throughout the fiscal year to get, dribs and drabs of money coming in. You're going to get a good chunk of it, hopefully, up front. The one thing that I'm struggling with a little bit is this whole annual adjustment and what the state's kind of putting out as the annual adjustment. So the main impact, and I kind of agree with this, is that for our current tax year for 2020, we're going to see significantly less of an annual adjustment associated with this tax year. And so, we'll see that in 22, 23. And that is, the state's now estimating that at about 172 million. It actually may even be a little bit higher depending on how the stock market goes for the rest of the year. But I want to point out, back in January, so this is part of the May revised budget. Back in January, the state estimated that amount to be 511.4 million. And so that kind of makes sense to me. It's like, okay, prior to COVID, we thought it was going to be pretty high. Now with COVID, it's going to go down. I get that. The one, it's the last bullet that I'm really having trouble with, because the state is estimating in the May revise that the annual adjustment for last tax year is going to be over $1 billion. It's $1,023.5 or $6 million. And that would be due to the 2020 or the 2019 tax year. Back in January, they thought it was going to be 572.8 million. So they basically have said that annual adjustment that we estimated in January, now we think it's going to be, almost 80% higher than what we had previously estimated based on what happened. And I'm having trouble really agreeing to that. It's also almost twice the $1 billion. Our largest annual adjustment that we've ever had was about $580 million. So to say that it's going to be over $1 billion, I think I think it's a stretch. Now, maybe it will be, and I hope for your guys' sake it does. But I personally cannot put that into a projection and realistically say that I would agree with that. But I want to give you all the information so that you can make your own decisions. And if you want to think it's going to be that high, then go for it. So looking at the actual numbers, so for current year, or for budget year for 2021, this is the state projection for the cash transfers. The $523 million of annual adjustment, that is known. That is the amount that was reported to the legislature last March. That will be deposited in July, and some of that will be, that's unreserved and unspent, will be distributed to you folks in August. It's this 21-22. Like I said, originally I thought it'd maybe be comparable, so I was down around $500 million. I said, okay, I'll up it a little bit to maybe $750 million, but I just don't see it coming in. The state's saying this number here is going to be $1,023 million. So keep that in mind, and I'll tell you what that means on the actual planning estimate or component funding in a minute. And then the 172 is again a state number. That may even be a little bit low, but in any case, those are kind of the revenue projections. So then what does that mean for you folks? Again, money goes into the fund, but what gets distributed out to you is what's unexpended and unreserved. I pulled out the debt service for No Place Like Home. The one thing that was a little bit different or didn't make a ton of sense to me is that the state's been taking about $7.5 billion for No Place Like Home this fiscal year, and then they're lowering it for next fiscal year, which doesn't make any sense. I would think it would continue. The debt service on a month-to-month basis would be the same, so I set it a little bit higher. And I keep pulling out until we get to about $130 million in 22-23. The nice thing about the current environment is that interest rates, as anyone with a savings account knows, are incredibly low. So more than likely, the interest rate that we're getting on this debt service is going to be pretty low. The state can use up to 140 million, but I'd be surprised if it goes over 130 million. And so what does this look like? We saw the decrease in 18-19. We saw a lower annual adjustment due to the 2016 tax year. We do expect large annual adjustments in 2021 and 2021-22 due to the large capital gains spike in 18-19 and in 2018 and 2019, and then we expect a lower annual adjustment based on the current year that will hit in 22-23. And then the other thing, just so you know, none of this component funding includes any of the redistributed, the reverted funds that are ultimately redistributed. So this is kind of where we're looking at current year. Like I said, I think the budget year, because that annual adjustment of $523 million is known, I think this is a decent figure. There's a chance the cash transfers would be lower or higher. Obviously, if we go into a second shutdown of the economy, it's going to be lower. But I think at this point for 2021, I would probably use that number. Again, what I'm struggling with is this 21-22 number. I say it's 1.9 billion plus or minus 250 million. So it could be anywhere from 1.7 billion to 2.2 billion, depending on what that annual adjustment actually turns out to be. I probably would look at my estimate here as a good starting point. I wouldn't necessarily be cutting programs in 2021, looking at that 21-22, based on that 21-22 number, because if it comes in a lot higher, you might have cut things that you didn't really need to cut. So just keep that in mind. I actually think the 22-23 number, even though it's further out, is a better number. I think we're going to be around 1.5 billion because, like I said, I think we're going to see a decrease due to this year, with the one caveat that, you know, the stock market's basically back up at its all-time highs. There's not a 100% correlation between the annual adjustment and you know, the stock market, but if we end up still pretty high and we don't have a significant decline, then that number could actually be higher. So a lot of uncertainty on the Mental Health Services Act side, and you know, you got to kind of make your call. I know a lot of you are doing the 3-year plans, you know, and I think this is a good starting point. If you think you need a little bit more to kind of carry you through, then maybe you up this, and your justification is based on what the state projected. But it's, you know, ultimately it's everybody's individual call on, and what I try to do is give you data that you can use and consider as you make your local decisions. So overall, you know, obviously, well, so we're losing core funding. And then we also, on top of that, have this lower federal Medi-Cal payments. Paul, I believe we've heard from several counties that they've seen a significant decrease in the volume of services. And I think Paul is going to talk about some of the relief that we've been granted to help offset some of this. Like I said, we've lost our core funding. It's, you know, and even after losing that, it's from my perspective, you guys are getting hit real hard for 1920. We start to see some climbing out of it going forward. But really, we're not going to be at the level of funding that we saw for 18-19 till probably for another 5, 6, 7 years. And obviously your costs continue to increase. And then we've got the increase in beneficiaries. Like I said, you know, unfortunately, a lot of this is counter-cyclical. So as the economy goes into a downturn, into a recession, there's a higher demand for your services, you have less revenue. Paul, is there anything else you want to?
I'll just add, I think the reason that we put this slide and then the next slide in there is to kind of recap, you know, the big picture of what's happening to us as a public behavioral health system right now, because this is something we're getting called upon a lot as CBHDA to explain to other behavioral health stakeholders and external partners how COVID-19 is impacting us from a fiscal and budget perspective. So these slides were just some of the highlights that you may want to draw on as you have conversations with others in your county who are not behavioral health fiscal experts, and you're trying to paint this picture for them. We know there's going to be, at the top of this slide, we're calling out an increased need for emergency response, which behavioral health is a part of. We know that COVID-19 is going to potentially drive people to experience more behavioral health symptoms and need to seek treatment. We're noting the heroic effort that you all put in to migrate services that were primarily face-to-face to telehealth and telephone, and then some of the other accommodations you've had to make since COVID-19 in terms of looking at expanding into alternative sites to create physical distancing, looking at how to support your subcontracted providers whose revenues also took a kind of immediate dip when the stay-at-home orders went into effect, et cetera. So can go on to the next section. And as we go to the next slide, I'll just call out for our CIBHS hosts I know we are wanting to wrap at 2:50, and I think I can cover most of this last section quickly, and then we can always come back to parts of it in the Q&A and go a little deeper. So we did want to provide some information about, again, with the understanding that the budget is still in proposed form from the legislature right now, and the governor has to come back to it, agree to sign or not, about some of the items that we have been working on both in the budget and then more broadly in response to COVID-19 to help, if possible, mitigate the negative impacts to your funding. So we can go ahead and jump to the next slide. This is sort of an overview of some of our priorities for budget advocacy. So Mike really did a great job covering the request to backfill realignment. I'll just kind of reiterate what we know and what we don't know about this. The governor's May proposal did not include any kind of voluntary contribution of state general fund to make up for the loss in revenues to realignment. And so as the legislature considered their proposal, we were working as CBHDA with CSAC and many of the county affiliate partners, such as County Social Services, to advocate that the state does step up and contribute something to help mitigate these losses. And so we were talking about total anticipated losses of $3.3 billion over 2 years for the two realignment accounts. We'll note that that impacts all the realignment programs, although we're focused on the impacts to public behavioral health. Our estimate was about $710 million lost for behavioral health specifically for the current year and budget year. And so what we landed on with our partners at CSAC and the county affiliates was a advocacy for this $1 billion backfill. And as Mike pointed out, that request includes a trigger mechanism so that $600 million of that would only be available to backfill realignment if we receive additional federal funding, leaving $400 million as just a general fund contribution. And so in the budget that the legislature passed, that is essentially the proposal for this $1 billion to be available with $600 triggered on availability of federal funds. Some of the detail here happens, as our ledge team just reminded me, in the form of budget trailer bills. So the main package that was passed on Monday has essentially a line item and then more specificity around exactly how the funding will flow, and the strings attached to spending it comes later in trailer bill language, and would emphasize that the language we've proposed in coordination with CSAC, et cetera, would split the backfill evenly between 2011 and 1991, and we concluded that this was probably the best option to maximize the funding available to behavioral health. A couple of the other items that we've worked on that are called out here, and I guess actually before I move on, I'll just reiterate, because I know this will be a question that comes up. When will we know about the realignment backfill? And the governor has until July 1 to make his move and decide whether to accept this proposal from the legislature or not. So that's when we'll know, in 2 weeks at maximum. And then No Place Like Home technical assistance deadline extension. We were trying to get a little bit of extra time for counties that are trying to spend No Place Like Home technical assistance funds. At this point, we have not been successful in getting an extension on that, so that's one that's not moving forward. Elimination of the integrated services for mentally ill parolee program and the parolee outpatient clinic funding. This was a cut that was included in the governor's proposal, and what I believe is in the legislature's proposal that we also advocated for. They would restore the funding for the parolee outpatient clinics so that that funding would not be cut and continue. The ISMIT program, which for any of you who don't know, is sort of almost like a full service partnership program that's been funded through the Department of Corrections in 8 large counties. And right now, I think it's serving a little over 600 parolees. That program is still on the chopping block, even from the legislature. And so we do anticipate that that program is likely to be cut in January of 2021. And that will be a population that is Medi-Cal eligible and for whom those 8 large counties are going to need to figure out how to deliver a pretty intensive level of service. So that we're having some ongoing meetings with CDCR to figure out what we can do to smooth over that transition. FERS funding, this is the Family Urgent Response System proposal for foster families to create sort of a statewide hotline and response system. That was also completely cut in the governor's version. The legislature's version would restore that cut. And then we'll talk about OIG recoupment a little later, and MHSA, I do have a couple of detail slides. So I guess I would ask CIBHS whether we should go ahead and talk through these now, or maybe come back and revisit them after the breakouts.
Yeah, that's what
makes sense.
I'm going to recommend, Paula, that we stick with our schedule, and so that people can get a break, but we absolutely want to see everything that you have to present today. So we'll make sure that that happens.
Great. All right. To be continued then.
Yeah, absolutely. So because it's to be continued, I'm not going to lead us all in wild applause virtually, but I can't tell you how delighted I am to see that you both still have awesome chops. I really want to alert people we're going to take a 20-minute break. That means be back at 3:10. And we invite you to use the open chat during this period. Just click the chat button and go to open chat, and please submit your questions for Paula and Mike. We have a good chunk of time, got 45 minutes for them to handle questions, and this is always one of the livelier discussions. I'm really hoping that you have something like this handy, and maybe even something like this to take care of your stress, or a back scratcher, pretzels. Anyway, take a good break, give us questions on chat, and we will see you in 20 minutes. Hi, everybody. We're coming back. Okay, I've got your questions here, but first we're going to let Paula finish with her slides. So take it away, Paula. They should be coming up fairly soon. Great.
Don't forget to unmute, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So based on the questions that I already saw coming into the chat box, I'm going to cover two topics, mainly the MHSA flexibilities and then the flexibilities requested by DHCS related to our CPE protocols and payment methodology. And then everything else that's in the slides, I would say is fair game for questions, but we'll focus on those two topics that I think have been important and are worth covering. So on MHSA, in addition to the advocacy that we've tried to do on things like backfilling realignment and securing state and federal emergency funding, we wanted to go for changes to existing MHSA requirements that would just allow you to use your funds more flexibly and more optimally in response to the COVID-19 emergency. And so this is, like all things MHSA, has kind of a important process story attached to it, which is that toward the beginning of the emergency, we had some ideas on the table for MHSA adjustments, and so did a variety of other mental health stakeholders. And so with a huge shout out to our Director of Governmental Affairs, Elia Gallardo at CBHDA, she worked with a really broad coalition of mental health stakeholders to sort of arrive at a shared proposal that we could move forward to both the legislature and the administration for some judicious MHSA. And another important process note on this, I think, is that these changes do need to be enacted through trailer bill language, which is still being hammered out. And that trailer bill will need a 2/3 vote of the legislature, because this MHSA, as you know, was originally a ballot initiative. And so the legislature has some authority to make changes to ballot initiatives as long as the changes they make are consistent with sort of the intention of the initiative as passed. If we propose anything too radical for a ballot initiative, then it has to go back to the voters, which is what we saw happen actually with No Place Like Home. It was originally passed, enacted through the legislative process, challenged in court, and then sent back to the ballot just to sort of validate the proposal that had been made. So on these proposals, it will be trailer bill. It will require 2/3. The key components that were agreed upon by the coalition is we want to request that counties can access prudent reserves immediately during the emergency, and so sort of bypass or override the typical criteria that have to be met in order to access your prudent reserves. And we can talk about that in a little more detail if that's useful to you. Next, we all could agree on deadline extensions. So extending the deadline for the 3-year planning process currently, and also potentially requesting extensions for annual updates, ARER submissions and some of your other MHSA administrative requirements. Another important flexibility that the coalition agreed to was some enhanced ability to move funds between MHSA components and to, temporarily during the emergency override some of the existing restrictions on how MHSA dollars are compartmentalized, but with limitations. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And then the last big sort of ask or priority here is to look at ways that we can avoid reversion, because we know that all of our core funding sources are looking to decline, as Mike just described, and the last thing we want is to see money revert when it could instead be used to shore up programs that are being impacted by those other losses in revenue. So these are kind of the big ideas that went into a very large coalition letter that we circulated and advanced in May. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about where this is now and what we know now. Thank you. So as I mentioned previously, we are passing a budget now, and then the legislature and administration will sort of retain the option to make changes after they have actual tax revenues tallied in August, now that the tax deadline is July 15th. So when we, as that mental health stakeholder coalition, approached the legislature about this, their ask back to us was, we are trying to do so much with the budget in such a short period of time. Can you prioritize a few of the things you want to see for this June budget cycle, and then come back in August when we all have our second bite at the apple and add in a few more? And so right now, what's on the table and being negotiated as part of trailer bill language is this kind of two phases of MHSA flexibility. In June, we're prioritizing the ask around immediately being able to access your prudent reserves in the coming budget year, again, regardless of the criteria that exist in the MHSA fiscal regulations, which go into effect July 1 of this year. And those fiscal regs include two specific sort of trigger mechanisms for when you'd be able to access prudent reserve. Again, can go into more detail if people want to discuss, but our concern is that neither of those trigger mechanisms or criteria will be met in the coming budget year, kind of because of the way they're structured and the way MHSA revenue flows. So this would allow you to access the prudent reserve on an emergency basis. We are looking to include the option to extend your 3-year plan deadline. And then one of the questions I saw in the chat box was about reversion part 1 and reversion part 2. And so specifically the piece around reversion that we're hoping to get into the trailer bill now immediately is simply to safeguard funds that are subject to reversion at the end of the current fiscal year. So basically extend your option to use that funding. And then when we get into August, the part 2 proposal on reversion would be the option to use dollars subject to reversion more flexibly for MHSA components other than the ones that they originally came from. And the other two pieces of what we would then hope to also push through in August would be flexibility related to innovations funding. So the ability for counties through your planning process to repurpose innovations funding for CSS or PEI components. And then also in August, we would hope to be able to propose lifting the 20% cap on transfers from CSS to wet capital or prudent reserve. And a quick note on the innovations piece, this again, what we really brought forward to the legislature and advocated for was a coalition proposal and a bit of a compromise. So it didn't necessarily have everything that we would like to see as counties, but it had everything that the broader behavioral health community could agree to. So one of the things that other stakeholders were not open to was an option to use PEI for something else and to move from the PEI component to others. So that is not part of the flexibilities that are being proposed and negotiated at this point. So I think we can advance the slides on that one, and happy to return to any of that and tell you what I can in the Q&A. These next few, I'm just going to ask Kristen to kind of click straight through. You have access to these. We were just sort of mapping out some of the other pots of emergency funding that have been discussed or proposed at the federal and state level, and I'm happy to give you a status update on those in the Q&A. And if we go forward, this one I want to pause on because I had also seen quite a few questions come through on this. So sort of similar to the idea of, you know, what can we do with MHSA to allow you to spend it with more efficacy during the emergency. We also worked with DHCS, and a big shout out to Mike on this one for helping us pinpoint some of what might be needed here to look at our Medi-Cal reimbursement methodologies for all three programs, so specialty mental health, drug Medi-Cal, state plan, and the DMC ODS, and propose some changes that could help basically mitigate the losses that counties and your subcontracted providers experienced in the sort of immediate first few weeks after COVID-19, when the shelter in place orders for most counties and providers really reduced the number of Medi-Cal services that you were able to claim for a period of time. And I know in some cases that service volume is now going back up, and many of you are close to previous levels. In other cases, you're still down. And so we worked with DHCS, also a shout out to DHCS for acting very, very quickly and proactively on this to request federal flexibility to make these changes to how we're reimbursed during the emergency period. So what was proposed for all three programs, again, was to basically, during the emergency period, so from March 1st, 2020 until the state of emergency is lifted, waive our interim rate setting methodologies to allow you to temporarily claim at higher interim rates than what was previously available. And there are nuances there for the three different programs that we can speak to a little bit in the Q&A. Number two was allow settlement strictly to cost rather than to the lower of cost or the provider's usual and customary charge, or in the case of the DMC state plan, the statewide maximum allowance rate. And then the last ask was to increase the maximum administrative reimbursement from 15 to 30% of your direct costs for Medi-Cal services. And so as of Monday, a lot of this was and has been approved by CMS, and DHCS is beginning to issue guidance to confirm that and to tell counties how it will be implemented. So the administrative reimbursement increase will be available for all three programs, specialty mental health, DMC, DMC ODS. That happens to be in statute for specialty mental health, so we had to enact that through an executive order, which the governor did, I believe, toward the end of April. DHCS plans to implement that through an adjustment to the cost report for the March through June period of the current fiscal year, and then going forward as needed. On the interim rate and cost settlement proposals, the proposals have been approved by CMS for the drug Medi-Cal state plan and for specialty mental health. and DHCS has released information notices explaining what's been approved. So for the DMC state plan, look at information notice 20-023. For specialty mental health, look at 20-031. For the DMC ODS, DHCS does anticipate that CMS will approve interim rate waivers and settlement changes there as well, but they have not yet released that confirmation in an information notice. And to quickly address something else I saw in the chat, I think it's worth clarifying what is happening here in terms of the interim rates for each program. So everything is still going to be settled to cost, and I would invite Mike to jump in and help clarify here if I say anything that's not clear. So we're not changing that fundamental requirement to settle everything to cost. What's happening is we're giving counties the option to claim some or all services at a higher interim rate in the 3 different programs. And so for drug Medi-Cal, what that means, the state plan, you can override the statewide maximum allowance rates set by DHCS. You could claim up to 100% increase above that SMA rate. However, what you claim still needs to reflect your actual cost or the actual cost to provide the service if it's a subcontracted provider service. So it's not advisable to simply double all the rates that we're claiming. I think that's a discretionary choice that counties will have to make based on whether your cost per unit has actually increased. Mike, do you want to say anything to sort of clarify or verify how that rate increase is meant to work?
No, that's exactly it. It's, the goal is to reimburse you, more real time on what your actual costs are rather than, waiting for interim cost settlement or audit. And so, yeah, if basically your program hasn't changed or that you've seen, for example, an increase in telehealth that has offset the decrease in face-to-face type of stuff, so that really your cost per unit hasn't gone up much, then you don't want to increase your rate. Otherwise you're going to end up with a significant, recoupment when you do the interim cost settlement. The only other thing I would add is on the contract providers, it's still, so it's based on actual costs and they don't have to look at their usual and customary charge, but it's still based on what you pay them, your CPE. So if they have actual costs over and above what you pay them, your reimbursement's going to be held to the CPE that you incur.
Thank you. And then let's see, I guess the other question I saw was about that lower of cost or usual and customary charge. And Mike, do you want to explain kind of why we requested that and why we hope that will simplify things when it comes time to audit the cost reports?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously our concern would be just the interpretation of what, and we've had this for years, what the interpretation of the usual and customary charge. And we wanted to leave it actual costs so to maximize reimbursement. So if you have, and really it shouldn't impact, I mean, whether we did this or not, should not have impacted, well, for one, any county operated providers, you're supposed to get actual costs. That's what's written into the state plan, and so you should get actual costs. So it was more to do with your contract providers, and the concern was that if you had a contractor who also contracts with other entities and had a different rate for the same service, that you could potentially get hurt there. So we thought, let's just get this out of there if we can, make it simple. You're getting actual costs, again, subject to CPE. but it just keeps it simple, and we don't have to get hung up about some potential interpretation, 6, 7 years from now.
Thank you. So that's an overview of where we are with those. And I think if we go ahead and skip through the next few slides, I think that's mostly, that kind of brought us to the end. We can go one slide forward. These were just a few sort of points for you all to mull over or bring up in the Q&A and discussion. Given the fact that, even if we are able to secure some realignment backfill or some emergency funding through these various state or federal opportunities, we are looking at decreases in our budget in the coming years. And that's likely to prompt you to have to make some tough decisions locally about how to absorb those decreases while still meeting your entitlement obligations for Medi-Cal. So just emphasizing at the top here that you do have to prioritize entitlement obligations. That includes all Medi-Cal services for specialty mental health and SUD, including acute psychiatric inpatient services and IMDs, which is an entitlement in California. And then we talk about trying to think about how you can maximize your revenue, maximize Medi-Cal FSP, look for opportunities such as the CARES Act funding, thinking about how you can use revenue more strategically by blending funding. And I think to Mike's earlier pieces of the presentation, to make sure you're very clear on the requirements for each funding source and which are more flexible than others, and sort of what the spending hierarchy should be as you're going through your budget and cost reporting process. And then shouting out that to the extent that you do have to reduce or eliminate programs, you should be looking at cost effectiveness. Non-required or non-entitlement programs are likely some of those funded exclusively by MHSA, and there is a cost effectiveness calculation that can be done. Anything you would want to add on this one, Mike, before we turn fully to questions?
No, I think that's good, Paula. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for answering a couple of the questions that you picked up off the feed, because we have 9 questions and I think you handled 2 of them very, very well. I'm just going to go from the top on these. We're still getting questions coming in. We've got less than a half an hour here, so I don't think I'm not sure we're going to get to those, but we'll do what we can. I'm going to take these in order. First ones first. So mental health services in jails. Is CDCR funding all health care for inmates in jails, including mental health, ? Is there an additional responsibility for realignment to provide these services?
So I'll start, and then Mike, you can jump in, but realignment is not, or at least our behavioral health realignment funds, we are not obligated to use that to provide in custody services. Those programs and services are budgeted through CDCR and not through realignment or county behavioral health.
Okay.
Does that hopefully answer the question? Anything?
Well, it doesn't answer the question about local pressure, but that's a different kind of question.
Yeah, and I think that's what you see, how your jail services are funded. It is a local discussion. Often often the sheriff has money, sometimes they don't. And so then you can use 91 realignment to fund those services. But it varies from county to county.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I think I heard that, and I was thinking about state services in our state prisons through Department of Corrections, but then the local services in jails are a different story.
That's true. They did mention CDCR, so that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, next question. Since we won't be receiving the VLF realignment, how is the state going to handle the offset for the OIG audit this year?
So I thought, well, Paula, correct me, I thought that was offset against the guaranteed amount. Was it treated similar to the managed care offset and state hospital offsets, or was it strictly offset against VLF?
I don't think it's strictly VLF, because the conversation that we've been having, and this is something that was somewhere in this slide deck or the other one too, with the state, is asking them to suspend the OIG repayments from counties in response to COVID-19. There has not been a willingness to do that. So my understanding is that that will continue to occur.
Yeah, so let me see what slide. I don't know if we want to look back at slides, but if we went to slide 47, it would be taken out of the CalWorks MOE swap. So if you look at that, I would imagine that's where they're going to offset it, that top line, not the VLF collection, the VLF base. Just like they do, like I said, that's where the managed care offset comes out of. That's where your state hospital offset comes out of.
Okay. I'm going to go to question 5. If we are happy with the rates that we are currently using and don't want to change them, is that a possibility?
Yeah, don't change them. I mean, if your rates, you're good, don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you share trailer bill specifics or general intentions regarding reversion, parts 1 and 2? Please and thank you.
Yes, and I think that's what I did try to cover when we went through that slide, is that kind of the 2 items related to reversion that we're looking at is hopefully in June, in this most immediate trailer bill, just safeguarding funds subject to reversion at the end of the current, or the budget year, sorry. And then in August, that proposal would be about the option to use dollars that are subject to reversion more flexibly for the different MHSA components. So I don't have a lot more information than that at this point about how that would work if the trailer bill goes forward, but happy to. I think a lot of you know where to find me and us at CMHCA, so we're always happy to take those questions and try to give you more detail offline.
Right, and it's a dynamic situation, right? Okay, Department of Healthcare Services says that for DMC ODS, we can settle to the lower of a provider's actual cost or usual or customary charge. For DMC state plan, DHCS provides the state's maximal allowable rate. How do we determine the, quote, customary or maximum allowable rate for DMC ODS? DMC ODS county contracts with the state identifies approved interim rates, but that should be different than the state maximum allowable rates. So this is again a rate question. Do you feel like you've already addressed that?
I think I would just note that, this may have come if my slides were imprecise, but the statewide maximum allowance, we were referring, when we say that, we're referring only to the DMC state plan, where those rates are still set by the state and typically can't exceed the statewide maximum allowance. So on the DMC ODS side, your ceiling, if you will, is the annually approved rates that you establish with DHCS for each service during the course of a fiscal year. And so what's been proposed for DMC ODS is to allow you to basically override those approved rates, again, if you need to reflect actual increase in cost per unit and exceed what's been approved without having to renegotiate a new approval with DHCS.
Okay, anything to add on that, Mike?
No, I think we're good. I want to go back to the last question though, because somebody just pointed out it was actually offset against the OIG was offset against your VLF base. I would imagine the way that it is written is that they will offset your 1991 realignment. I could be wrong. So, but in any case, I would expect them to offset that the higher what's left. So.
Okay, great.
Unless
Appreciate
CVHDA
that because we can.
Yeah, unless CVHDA gets them to not offset anything because it was their fault anyway, right?
I was going to say, but we can verify that too, that how it's written and what the intention is going forward, and apologize that is not one that we've gotten traction on so far, is suspending that withhold.
Great. Okay. This is one where I think, I'm not sure if there's more you want to say about this, so I'm just going to throw it out there. Is there going to be any new information on MHSA reversion? Since departments are going to be down some funds in other funding streams, can we ask the state to freeze MHSA reversion during this time, knowing that counties will more than likely need these funds?
I think that's the type of thing that we're considering in trying to work on this MHSA focused trailer bill language, is to forestall reversion by whatever means we can. And I didn't hear if part of the question was freezing it more indefinitely. I think we're having, since it's trailer bill, we're having to approach it year by year. I don't know that there's a mechanism to just completely, since this would be on an emergency basis, completely change that on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Anything for that to add, Mike?
Nope.
No. Okay. Well, we're doing great, actually. When is increased FMAP likely to be implemented?
I would love to know. If we have DHCS folks with us that know more than I do, please feel free to chime in the chat, because it sounds like what we've been told by DHCS's local government financing division is just that this has been kind of a ongoing back and forth between the state and the federal government to determine exactly how that will be implemented, and we don't really have an ETA for that guidance or the funding at this point. But I think one important thing to note is that it's supposed to, based on federal law, take effect January 1 of 2020. So at whatever point the guidance comes out, it would be retroactive back to January 1.
Okay. So we do have time to move on to these other questions. We've got another about 10 minutes, a little over 10 minutes. So Jerry, were you going to jump in here with the questions, or should I just read it from the group chat?
Christy, if you're able to read it from the chat, I think that might be the smoothest. There's a few in there.
Okay. Let me see here. Want to make sure I don't skip over any of these. Okay, here's the next one. With regard to MHSA reverted funds that have been reallocated back to the counties, do they have to go back to the original component from which they came? For example, we received a small amount of reallocated wet funds. Do we have to put those funds back into wet, or do they get allocated to CSS, PEI, and innovation?
Yeah, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the answer to that is right now, under existing regulations, yes, they do have to go back to the original component. And that's one of the things we're hoping to change if we get our second pass at the budget in August.
Yes.
Okay. Has the state indicated how they process the additional 6.2% FMAP, for example, require replacement claiming?
I'm trying to think if in any of our conversations, we've asked that specific question about replacement claiming, and I don't think we have asked. So I don't know what their plan is at this point.
I would hope not. If you go back to when we had the ARA, which was the temporary increase in FMAP, you basically got a separate remittance advice kind of for those, that bump. I would hope they could do something similar without requiring resubmission of claims.
Okay, regarding the recent rate increases due to COVID, can counties behind on their cost reports increase their rates for this time period as well?
So this has nothing to do with cost reports. Well, I shouldn't say that. Whatever your maximum rates are in the system right now, you can double them. And your maximum rates are based on prior year cost reports. So if you're behind on cost reports and your maximum rate, for example, is based on your, for your 2015-16 cost report, you can still double it just like everybody else, if that's what the question was. But it's really just a doubling of your maximum interim rate.
Okay, so the answer is yes, if you can support those costs.
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously you don't want to double rates that you're not going to have costs to support, or you'll have a large recoupment.
Right. Okay, let's see, you may have answered this. Is allowing settlements to cost for both county program and contracted providers?
Yes, but again, for the contractors, the county actually has to incur certified public expenditure, which also protects you then, right? So if you've got contract maximums, counties can't willy-nilly submit a cost report with more expenditures than what's the contract max and what you pay them. So you got that provision. The other thing, we talked about this a little bit, at least I think Paula did. This is effective March 1st. So you're gonna have a funky cost report for 1920 and probably for, in 2021, because more than likely this emergency is still gonna be going on come July. But yeah, so it's actual cost, but subject to a certified public expenditure.
Okay. Is there any advocacy of increasing the NTP rates?
Yes, somebody asked me that a little while ago and I didn't know, but I have since learned that I believe the NTP associations did put forward a proposal, but I do not think that DHCS has advanced their proposal to CMS or taken steps to approve or move that forward yet. I think it's still under consideration at the DHCS level. So we will definitely keep you all updated if we learn more about that.
Okay. Some of our contracted providers receive a PPP loan. Would DHCS consider the loan as a revenue source to offset the costs for cost settlement?
Yes, they should. I mean, and the PPP things, it's kind of changing. So whatever costs, so if a provider gets a PPP loan and that loan gets forgiven, which they may not know now until the end of December, then that should be treated as a revenue to cover the costs that the provider identified in getting the loan forgiven. They've got to identify specific staffing and utilities, stuff like that. So whatever those activities were used or reflected on the cost report, that would be a revenue to offset those costs. If they were used to provide Medi-Cal services, then it's going to reduce your the FFP that provider is entitled to.
Right. Okay.
And I think can
sorry.
I add to that one quickly, Christy?
Of course.
I was just going to add that DHCS also recognizes that there's implications for cost reporting on the PPP loans, and want to help make sure that providers and counties, and then DHCS on the audit side, takes a consistent approach to that. So DHCS has let us know they do plan to issue guidance specifically about reporting the PPP loans. And we had also had some discussion in CBHDA's Financial Services Committee about putting forward a couple of our suggestions about how that should be treated, which I think is probably consistent with what you just said, Mike, just that assuming the loans are forgiven, we would want to see it treated as additional offsetting revenue, sort of in the same way that private insurance or Medicare payments are treated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And again, it's, I mean, so on Medicare and insurance, you're getting payment for a specific service that's identified. In this particular case, they're getting a payment for a specific cost, and they've identified that because they have, like I said, they've got to do a mini cost report kind of in order to get the loan forgiven. But more than likely, there's going to be more changes to the program. So there might be this blanket thing that comes out that if your PPP was under 150K, then it's automatically forgiven. That might make it a little more difficult, but yeah, it's the same concept though.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm just going to take them in order again. Will the 30% admin be settled back down to 15% max for the year when doing annual cost report, or will this allow to actual with the 30% cap during the time frame?
I would think it would be 30% actual during the time frame, right, Paula? I mean, because there's only one provision in state statute or regs, I forget which, that has the 15%. And so if the executive order increased that to 30%, it's both on the claiming side and on the settlement side.
Yes, and the way DHCS has explained it to us, again, to go back to something you just mentioned, Mike, is that you're going to have this funky split in your cost report where beginning on March 1, you can use this higher 30% ceiling on the administrative costs. And so for that period, March 1 to the end of the current fiscal year, and then whatever period the emergency extends next year, you're not going to be forced back down to the 15%. You can go up to 30.
But it's still based on actual cost at settlement too. So don't just start claiming at 30% if you don't have actual costs that are going to support that level of administration reimbursement.
Yes, leads to a lot of sadness. Okay, last question. Mike, would you please clarify the 1991 and 2011 realignment backfill assumptions in the tables? Your notes on the 1991 slides say that 200 million SGF will be distributed in August. The 1991 table shows 43.2 million. Your notes on 211 backfill say 200 million SGF. The table shows 49.4. I must have missed something. Thank you.
No, so the 200 million and the 200 million state general fund for each and the 300 million federal fund for each represents the total amount for the entire funding. So all of 1991, social services, mental health, public health. All of 2011, law enforcement, social services, mental health. So let me just give you, and so this was some preliminary trailer bill language that could change. I mean, I don't want to say it's set in stone, that I take the 200 and the 300 million and whittle it down to what would be mental health. The 91 trailer bill language that was in draft had 21.5797 of the amounts going to mental health. And then for the 2011, the trailer bill language has 64.4432% of the total amount going to the support services account. And of that amount, 38.3055% going to the behavioral health sub account, which I think when you multiply that all out, it's like 24.72%. So, and I apologize, I probably should have made it a little clearer in the slides that the 500 million total is for the entire program, the entire 1991 realignment program, the entire 2011 realignment program, and then the amounts in the charts are specific to mental health on the 91 side, behavioral health on the 2011 side.
Great.
But those could change. I mean, as Paula said, they got the one number in the budget bill that the legislature put forth, and the devil's in the details with the trailer bill.
Okay. I think that's it on the questions. And I have to say, I always enjoy both of your presentations, and it's always eye-opening, and makes me glad I'm retired, frankly. So thank you very much. And we're going to hang on to Paula, and we're going to do hot topics. I'm wondering, I'm seeing Beth here. Beth, did you have something you wanted to weigh in with? No, okay. She's muted. You're muted.
The next thing is actually the breakout activity and not the hot topics. So,
Oh, okay. So you get a break, Paula. We'll come back to you in a few minutes. Okay.
And I'm going to hang on to Mike if possible to help with the Q&A.
That's always a good call. Okay, we'll see you two in a few minutes. Okay, sorry, Beth. I thought something got left out of my. Okay, I'm going to toss it to Beth now for a breakout session.
Okay, and do we have the slide with the question on it? Here we go. So we are going to move into a breakout session, and this is going to be a pretty quick breakout session. There will be somewhere between 5 and 10 folks in each breakout session. I'm not sure how the math works out, but what we're going to have you do is to just go around the virtual room and each share your response to the question that's on your screen right now, which is, given all the information Paula and Mike presented, what is the first thing you want or need to do tomorrow? And then also share a little bit about why you think that's the first thing that you need to do. And we will give you 20 minutes in the breakout session, and then we will give you a 5-minute warning when that 20 minutes is almost up. And then we will bring you back, do a little bit of a debrief, and then we will move on to hot topics. When you're in your breakout session, you can turn on your camera if you like, so that you can see who you're talking with, so that when we actually are able to get back together, you'll be able to recognize those folks with whom you've been conversing in our online sessions. So Kirsten, if you want to go ahead and assign everybody their breakout rooms, we'll go ahead and let you folks get started. Again, the question is, given all of the information Paula and Mike presented, what is the first thing you want or need to do tomorrow? For those of you still in the main room, be sure to click join when the pop-up comes in so that you can be joined into your breakout room.
Oh, can people hear now?
I can hear.
Okay.
We also decided that that content sort of fit better in the context of the budget and fiscal projections discussion that we just had. So just to verify, this is not another presentation on MHSA and COVID-19. I've shared what I know on MHSA flexibilities at this point. So what we're doing for the next half hour is covering a few additional topics that I've been getting a lot of questions about and that you might want to keep on your radars. And then we'll see, hopefully leave enough time for some discussion so you all can highlight the things that are most relevant to you and which you want to know more about, because we do have additional fiscal leadership sessions coming up, and we may be able to return to some of these topics and do more in depth with help from our friends at DHCS as well. So if I can get this to advance here. Let's see, here we go. So the topics that I wanted to touch on quickly: COVID-19 provider payments and relief funding, which we already got into a bit in the Q&A and the last presentation. I saw a question last time around on pending recoupments, offsets, and paybacks. So we can check in on what we know and don't know on those topics. DHCS just shared their proposal for a new timeline for cost report audits and settlement. So wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that, and there'll be more to come. Lots of dialogue recently on the SAMHSA block grants, and then sort of a listing of the many information notices that have come out recently, which you may or may not have had time to attend to, given all the COVID-19 and other activities that you're focused on. So starting here, we pretty much covered this previously in the Q&A. This was just another slide to sort of be very clear about the fact that what's been proposed by DHCS and largely approved by CMS during this emergency period related to our payment methodology and rates is not something that you have to do in all cases. It's discretionary. It's a choice you can make to claim at higher interim rates if that reflects your costs and makes sense. Then a secondary decision that you would have to make is how to pass that additional money that you're able to claim on through your provider contracts. So a few of our provider associations and advocates were also very active right at the start of the emergency to put forward ideas about what they thought could help them whether the drop in potential drop in their revenues that they would face under some current contract structures if they delivered markedly fewer Medi-Cal services. So some counties have been taking action, again, depending on the circumstances with your providers and what those impacts have been locally, to, in some cases, shift provider contracts to a cost basis if they previously weren't. In some cases, adopt 1/12 contracts. What we're pointing out here is that for those who are moving to the 1/12 contracts, sort of the lowest risk model is to make a monthly payment to the provider based on actual costs, sort of not to exceed 1/12 of the contract maximum. If you made monthly payments based solely on that 1/12, you would run the risk of overpaying the contractor. And then the last piece is to decide whether you adjust interim rates for either your county operated or your subcontracted services, which is only necessary for providers or programs that are experiencing significant decreases in the service volume, which increased your cost per unit. So again, I saw lots of questions on this popping into the chat. Just want to make it clear that it's a decision you make. It's not something that is going to happen on kind of a blanket basis. And then I appreciated the distinction that Mike made, which is that in terms of the changes at settlement, what's been changed is the requirement to settle to lower of CPE cost or usual and customary charge. And they're waiving the piece of that would require you to look at the provider's usual and customary charge. So that leaves you with settling to the lower of cost or CPE. And so wanted to be really clear that the sort of sloppy wording in my previous slides that just referenced cost, don't let that make you doubt what you know about CPE being the relevant piece for some of your payments. And we give another shout out here to, we don't need to increase rates if we're able to maintain previous volume. So the importance of looking at maximizing your Medi-Cal billing in any way you can, even as the pandemic continues. So this was a slide to sort of call that out and look at how you're enrolling clients in Medi-Cal, how you're minimizing disallowances, everything you can do to keep billing Medi-Cal. And then here we talked about the PPP loan issue, which I think we covered pretty thoroughly in the Q&A. The other thing we wanted to call out was a new pot of funding that we were all just alerted to last week. So this is also CARES Act funding, but it's not to be confused with the CARES Act county allocations that will be flowing through the state budget. This is a pot of CARES Act funds that the federal government is making available for eligible Medicaid providers. It's $15 billion that providers can apply for by July 20th. DHCS circulated this widely last week because it's applicable to both counties for county operated Medicaid programs and providers, and then also to your CBOs. And the application language is a little bit confusing or misleading because it seems to reference billing Medi-Cal directly and fee-for-service, but CMS's announcement of this made it pretty clear that states and providers that operate and bill Medi-Cal under managed care programs are also eligible to apply for this funding. And they're, again, have to act to claim these funds by July 20th. There is some data that has to be submitted, worksheets on your gross revenues and FTE. And then the funds, again, the purpose is to prevent, prepare for, respond to COVID-19. So similar to the previous slide on CARES Act funding, this is meant to reimburse only expenses or lost revenues related to the pandemic and is not, can't be used in a completely unrestricted manner. So I think that partly we're calling this out just to make sure everybody's aware of this and can go look at it and determine whether it makes sense for you to apply. If you do and receive this funding, then I anticipate it's going to bring up similar questions to the PPP loans about how the funds should be treated for cost report purposes. So we can circle back on that if that during the Q&A, if that seems helpful. This is something else I saw pop up in the chat box. Pending recoupments, offsets, and paybacks. So depending on how long you've been in your role, you have probably been alerted to or part of several different scenarios where the state paid counties erroneously and then had to come back and recoup that from you in some way. And there's been quite a few of these sort of bubbling up recently. And so what we have asked DHCS to do is to essentially give us a summary of the pending recoupments or paybacks that are underway and the statewide amounts, the county specific amounts, and sort of the terms and circumstances for each one, so that many of you may have clarity on these because you've been tracking them as they come along, but in other cases, we've heard some questions and some need for clarification. So really quickly, the OIG, we talked about that our assumption is that that's proceeding, but appreciate the clarifying question about VLS, so we can be sure to revisit that and make sure we're giving you clear information about what's happening there. On another one of these is the repayments related to ACA expansion and Medi-Medi aid codes. This is something that's been in the works for, I want to say, a year or more, but we had been, DHCS had been working to get the correct amounts per county calculated and get you more information on that. So most recently, some counties have received sort of updated invoices for these payments. DHCS has told us that all counties should be receiving an invoice related to this issue. The county can pay that up front, or DHCS will offset the claims. But again, I do not have a breakdown of the statewide or county specific amounts for this issue. Next, I think the question that came up specifically in the chat was for additional information about the managed care or inpatient offsets and the error that had happened there, where DHCS was not including and offsetting all the appropriate aid codes. So there's been an increase in your offset. That statewide total is $154 million over 4 years, with the offsets scheduled to begin in 2021-22. But DHCS is, I believe, still working to provide county-specific amounts unless anyone has gotten that information, and I'm not aware. And then the last piece of this we did want to spend a little time on. There is, unfortunately, a new payback or recoupment that's going to have to happen. This came out as part of the May revised budget and will be included in whatever version is passed. So what happened here, DHCS discovered that the state as a whole had been inappropriately claiming FFP for ineligible beneficiaries across all Medi-Cal programs. And specifically, these were beneficiaries in certain aid codes or groups that are supposed to be paid for on a state-only basis and not eligible for FFP. So examples would be qualified immigrants. These would be people who may be green card holders or otherwise in the country legally. There's a 5-year waiting period after you establish that you're here legally 5 years before you're eligible for federal financial participation if you're enrolled in a Medicaid program. Since I think 1996, states have had the option to go ahead and cover that population with state-only funds. California does that, but apparently we had been mixing up aid codes and claiming FFP for that population that's ineligible. And so at this point, the state and the federal government have identified the issue and are working out a repayment plan. And DHCS or the state is going to have to repay at least a portion of the federal funds that were erroneously claimed. It looks like they're doing a look back on this at least to 2008 at this point. And DHCS has estimates of the amount that needs to be returned, including a portion that will be the responsibility of counties, since FFP that was claimed erroneously for some aid codes where counties put up the match was provided to you in return. And should also add that this is bigger than just behavioral health. The Medi-Cal managed care plans were subject to this error as well. So there's a large recoupment amount for them too. The way this is being proposed to be done in the budget is that for the coming budget year, both state and counties portions of the federal reimbursement for behavioral health will be paid with general funds. So that's $148.5 million in general funds that will cover what the state owes and also what needs to be recouped from counties. And then beginning in 21-22, the state will expect counties to begin repaying roughly $63 million statewide. We do not have county-specific amounts on this either, or details yet on exactly how this will work, since again, the repayment from counties is not expected to take effect till 21-22. So I will stop there on that one, and we can circle back to it if people want to, but did want to put that on your radars as something where we hope more information is forthcoming. And in a similar vein, also important to have on your radar if you don't already, on last week's all-county call, DHCS shared the two charts that I have here in the slides. They are mapping out a plan and a timeline that DHCS wants to commit to for bringing the audit and cost report process more current, essentially. So this, for example, is the proposed timeframe for specialty mental health cost reports and audits, looking back at fiscal year, all the way back to fiscal year 13-14, which has not yet been finalized, and starting to sort of accelerate or compress how quickly DHCS moves through these cost reports, so that ultimately they would hope that fiscal year 19-20 would be audited and finalized by January of 2023. So at that point, you'll be essentially only 2 years behind, as opposed to 6 or 8 years behind, which we've been in the past. And they have a similar timeline mapped out for DMC, which was a little more caught up, but still they will try to bring that more current into the same time frame as specialty mental health. And one piece of discussion we did have on the all-county call last week was that DHCS is doing this with existing resources. They're not staffing up to do this, but they have committed to restructuring or reprioritizing as needed. And this partly came about because payment reform had been contemplated as part of CalAIM. And one of the things that we really advocated for as your association was to speed up these final cost report and reconciliation periods so that you don't have to carry so many years of risk on a go-forward basis as we're looking at shifting to an entirely new payment system. One thing we did say at the time, though, and I think many of you have been great advocates for, is doing this more quickly takes person hours and resources and efforts on the part of county fiscal staff as well. And at this point, you may or may not feel that you have the resources to proceed on this timeline. So I think this is a discussion we're going to need to continue to have as an association and with DHCS about how counties can work to meet DHCS where they are on this and move more quickly to get us out from under all this risk. I will not spend time on this. I just wanted to do a quick call out on the block grant issues that we had a CBHDA call on this, and then DHCS had a webinar yesterday just to revisit all the, number one, all the administrative changes that they've made, particularly to the substance abuse block grants, and then also share with counties the data they have on historical underspending of both block grants and talk about the strategies for improving and increasing the way that block grant dollars are spent going forward. So this was kind of a snapshot of some of the block grant issues that you may still have questions on or be considering as you work on your budgets. And then last but not least, information notices. One thing I'll just highlight from a process standpoint, DHCS has been to sort of help minimize the delays that happen when they need to post things on their website and they need to be ADA compliant, et cetera. They've been pushing out guidance via email ahead of the time when they post it. So, for example, when I made these slides on Monday, some of these notices were posted, some had only gone out via an e-blast that I think goes to directors, and I'm not sure who else is getting these DHCS email updates, but they had sent out several new information notices. And so we have a couple that we've touched on, the 20-031 that is actually, they included DMC-ODS in the heading. It's really about the specialty mental health CPE flexibilities during the COVID-19 emergency period. 20-030, there's several of these that are the notices that come out every year to update certain things. So the regional average rates for non-contract psychiatric inpatient hospitals for 1920. 20-029 about establishing your county contracted rate for specialty mental health. I should have put that in the slide in the short dole system for 2020 and 21. The DMC state plan and DMC ODS MAT reimbursement rates. And then here we have SABG performance contract, MHSA population estimates, more COVID-19, many topics coming out quickly in information notices. So just wanted you to have that list at your fingertips. And so for I think we have maybe 7 or 8 minutes left that we could do a few questions and discussion. I would be interested, if nothing I've said sparked questions for you, I would be interested in hearing from you on some of these things. If you have adjusted provider contracts, how that's working. If you plan to apply for the CARES Act Medicaid provider funding. If you have thoughts or questions about DHCS's proposed audit and settlement timelines, outstanding questions about block grant issues, or hot issues or topics that we haven't brought up at all today that you want us to be thinking about that might be fair game for future fiscal leadership institutes. So I'll stop there and see what we have time for in questions.
Wonderful. Don't forget to unmute.
Paula, I don't know if you can hear me. I have a question.
Yes, you're doing great.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. So this is Adriana Bear from Santa Cruz, and my question is in the application for the federal funds, the Medicaid new funds, I think the second or third bullet says that we cannot have had CARES funds already, and I want to make sure that we are interpreting that correctly. Our agency has received funds, but behavioral health hasn't. Do you have any guidance on that? How we should read that?
Yes, that's a great question. And I am not going to be able to answer with perfect precision right now, but feel free to follow up with me because this is something we did look at last week when this came out. I believe that bullet that you're talking about refers to a specific pot of CARES Act funding that was previously distributed that providers are not supposed to be able to dip into both of those pots. It does not refer to the money that is flowing out to states and cities and will come to you through the budget. So our read was that that exclusion really shouldn't affect counties, but I can give you, if you want to follow up, I can give you a little more detail about which pot of money that is and exactly why we think it's not.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. I'll send you an email.
Thank you.
Paula, on that particular question, so I don't know if Adriana was relating it to that most recent announcement about available funding, but what we were told locally is that other parts of the county, like fire and the county hospital, had applied for funding, so we wouldn't also still be eligible. Does that sound correct?
We will follow up and try to be really clear about this. I appreciate the additional question, but this, this application and this pot of money is for Medicaid providers specifically. So the one that was just circulated by DHCS last week. So it doesn't make sense to me that you would be excluded from the Medicaid provider funding if you'd received CARES Act funding for other services, but we will verify that.
I have a question here, Paula. I would like to know if any other counties are having trouble with their approved Medi-Cal units of service matching on the reconciled cost report to the state's records. We are a Cerner county and we've had large discrepancies. How do other Cerner counties handle this? Is that something that you can take a stab at?
Not me so much, but if people want to respond to that in the chat and you all can read it out, that's interesting. That hasn't been on my radar yet.
I don't know that I can really help, but we've had some discrepancies as well, and we're Cerner County, and we just had to really drill down into getting a report with the state that showed finding the record on theirs and finding it on ours and seeing why it looked different. And we were able to come up with some things, but it's going to be pretty specific to your county and how you set up your system.
Thank you. I've got one more question here. Is there anything in writing from DHCS for the 30% admin rate? If info notice, which number?
Good question. I think that the primary guidance on that is going to take the form of cost report instructions. And so what I've heard most recently from DHCS is that they have the adjusted cost report templates already prepared. They've actually shared that, I think, with a couple of counties for feedback. And then when they release those, there will be instructions that go with them that addresses that specifically the potential increase in administrative reimbursement. Right now, what we have on that is the executive order that waived the piece of statute, and then DHCS has a slide presentation on their COVID-19 response page that sort of reiterates what the plan is. I don't think they say much about that in the information notices that have been published up to now, but some of you are probably looking at them, so you can correct me in the chat if that's wrong.
Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our day here. And Paula, thank you so much. I think you gave a really powerful ending to a long afternoon and an intense and technically complex afternoon. And I'm seeing applause. Thank you. Applause for Paula. I wish it were louder. And also, I wish Mike were here to get some applause as well. The two of you did fantastically. So thank you ever so much, and look forward to seeing you again. I'm just going to wrap up here. We hope you've enjoyed this afternoon and found it useful. On the slide that's going to pop up here, you're going to see a QR code that links to the online survey. And you can use your iPhone with a camera app and open it and point it at the QR barcode. A prompt will pop up at the top of your screen to automatically take you to the survey. Or we have also added the link to the survey in the chat box. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. We really do pay attention to it, and it helps us to shape future institutes. Participants of this webinar who are looking for CPE credits, you must fill out the survey and select yes when asked about continuing education credits. It will prompt you to fill out your name, license number, and then sign your survey. Our next Fiscal Leadership Institute webinar will be held again on Zoom, Wednesday, July 22nd, from 1 o'clock to 5 p.m. and will highlight SUD and mental health cost reporting and block grants, along with a story of recovery. These are always inspiring. The other upcoming webinar dates are shown on your screen, and links to our website where you can register to attend the remaining 3. We look forward to having you join us again on the 22nd of July, and thank you for your kind attention today. If you have any further questions or need anything else, please don't hesitate to let us know. And have a lovely evening. Relax. We're done. Au revoir.